you're going to...
No, I think why don't you just
All right.
get rolling?
Well, the last class was mostly built around Parmenides, the Parmenides dialogue, and we had a section we read of the Lynn's paper on his discovery, where he talked about Parmenides, and then what we did was we read through his Parmenides' attack on, in the dialogue, again, he's attacking the Platonic idea of forms, and he specifically attacking the young Socrates and who believes in forms, and to challenge, some of the paradoxes that he and Zeno, or particularly Zeno, was presenting to the people there, and then after he's attacked theory of forms, and Socrates says, well, what, he says, really, you're so young, you need to learn proper method. So, okay, so Socrates, okay, give us a lesson, show us how to do it. So then he goes into this lengthy discussion of the one and the many and the paradoxes. It's all a whole lengthy thing. It's an inductive system, and so inevitably you end up with all kinds of these paradoxes and contradictions, and he goes through several different ways of doing this, starting with the one, then he says that leads to paradoxes, then he says the one is, and what happens with that, and that one you end up with a certain point where he says, well, if the one is, it exists in time, and then he says, well, what happens when you go from the one, when the one goes to the many? And he says, well, when does that happen? He says, that happens in the instant, that weird thing called the instant. And so there is, well, the way Lynn describes that, Plato's playing a little joke on these Eleatics. In other words, he's introducing change. Of course, nothing, otherwise it's just blah, it's just this inductive system over and over again. And so, and what Lynn means by it, though, is axiomatic revolutionary change. It's not just any old change. So that's... So why is Lynn so fascinated with this dialogue? Well, because he sees it as an expression of what he calls the higher hypothesis, a fundamental axiomatic change, which he compares with two other things. He compares it with Georg Cantor's idea of the transfinite, and he also compares it with Kuhse's solution to the question of the quadrature of the circle. And all three of those he feels are essential to his own development of the theory of his own theory of knowledge. As you'll see, we're not going to take it up this time, but Lynn has his own developed theory of knowledge, and it's basically the idea is that what you want to understand is it's a subjective thing. Science is subjective. What's basic to science is the mental processes which constitute a higher hypothesis, which links a series of discoveries which are actually generated by a certain higher hypothesis. And so, as far as I know, that's unique to Lynn, and that's his development of economic science. We'll come back to that. Now, in terms of this group of these Eleatics, that Parmenides and Zeno belong to, as far as I can see, they represent a certain oligarchical viewpoint. The idea of reducing everything to the one, saying, well, the many isn't valid because the many can be infinitely subdivided, and what's interesting, I think, is come back to Leibniz. First of all, you'll see this thing we're going to go through, hopefully, is Leibniz is giving you a response to one of Zeno's paradoxes. He's actually offering a solution to it. In the course of this 10-page essay, he's actually giving you a solution to the paradox. And this was called to my attention in this book by Professor Richard Arthur, because he says that this particular essay by Leibniz is a very good answer to it. And I think it is, actually. You'll see for yourself if you The arrow paradox, it's called.
The arrow paradox?
The arrow paradox, yeah. So the other thing is that in this connection is Leibniz's encounter with Spinoza. See, when in the early, I think, 1670s, Leibniz was very eager to meet with Spinoza. I guess he'd heard things about him from a friend of his, Chernhaus, and he wanted to talk. And Spinoza was very much reviled. You know, he'd been excommunicated by the Jewish community and condemned as a heretic. And but apparently, you know, Leibniz really wanted to find out what he was all about, and actually eventually met with him. But Leibniz reacted very violently to Spinoza, because Spinoza believed that there's really only one substance. God is the one substance, and everything else is just modalities of that substance. And from Leibniz's point of view, that was false and very dangerous, because from his standpoint, it attacked the whole idea of free will. So he thought it was a very immoral doctrine. And it reminds me somewhat of Lin's response to reading Norbert Wiener on statistical definition of negentropy. And Lin was very provoked by it, and as he said, and that provoked him to refute it. And I think Spinoza, this thing had a big influence on Leibniz, his determination to refute it, and the kind of ideas that he came up with to refute it. His notion of substance that you'll be seeing. So again, this Parmenides dialogue is the centerpiece in a way of this book, The Science of Christian Economy. The numerous sections where Lin comes back to it, and it's very well worth going through. Now, the first thing I wanted to read is go through. We can put up this dialogue. There are the section in Project A called Leibniz's Mind.
Not quite yet.
If somebody can read that, we can get it put up.
Scott's opening the book.
I'm sorry?
What page are you saying?
What page?
Where is it in the book?
Yeah.
Page 107.
107.
We have some copies back here
Right.
on the shelf.
I am.
Want me to read, Ernie?
Huh?
Should I read?
Yeah, might as well read it from the book, yeah, if you don't have it up on the screen.
Leibniz's mind. Now we turn to the question of scientific thought. Some time ago, I made a reply to a paper in which Leonard Euler had attacked Leibniz's monadology. In that connection, I emphasized two things about Euler's attack on Leibniz, beyond the bare fact that it is simply incompetent. I emphasized the fact that Euler's argument was not physics in the first place, and showed what its fallacies were geometrically, the nature of its geometrical fallacies. I also emphasized that the empirical basis for knowing the monadology does not lie in some abstract, arbitrary geometric construction, but rather lies in a very simple demonstration of physics. For example, it is shown that all creative reason, and therefore all knowledge of the lawful ordering of our universe, is associated with a sovereign power of creative individual reason in the individual personality. Hence, that individual is, as Leibniz emphasized, a monad. Hence, the organization of the universe is based on the action corresponding to creative reason by monads. That is physics. It can be demonstrated that in no other way can we possibly achieve science. The notion that a science, an empirical science, leads us to a different kind of view, that is, the Euler view, is absurd. For example, in a universe which undergoes change, we can demonstrate creative reason in the case of human behavior, that is historical behavior, as the creative lawful ordering of change. In such a universe, one can know the lawful ordering of things only by a knowledge of a transfinite ordering, which corresponds to that lawful ordering, the creative lawful ordering. In such a universe, one can know the lawful ordering of things only by a knowledge of a transfinite ordering, which corresponds to that lawful ordering, the creative lawful ordering. For example, as I indicate this extensively, and I think in what is a very happy mode of representation of pedagogy, in defense of common sense, only the principle which determines the ordering implicitly of the successive scientific revolutions, that is, as I did with the A through E lattices, only that principle represents knowledge. Only that principle corresponds, even in approximation, to a lawful ordering of the universe. Therefore, any knowledge of the universe as to the principle of ordering can only arise from the standpoint of the creative reason, that is, the sovereign creative reasoning powers of the individual. Being conscious of those sovereign creative reasoning powers and other creative phenomena which are analogous, shall we say, to what happens in creative reasoning.
Somebody else?
Does that make sense, though, that any knowledge of the universe, and let me reread that paragraph. Therefore, any knowledge of the universe as to the principle of ordering can only arise from the standpoint of the creative reason, that is, the sovereign creative reasoning powers of the individual, being conscious of those sovereign creative reasoning powers and other creative phenomena which are analogous, shall we say, to what happens in creative reasoning. That gives us the essential map of the universe in germ. To go further, we have to take the other principles into account. We have already demonstrated again, socially, that the efficiency of creative reason is, in first instance, represented by the nature of the connection of each isolated individual who does creative reasoning in our society in the present with the past, present, and the future, as I have indicated earlier. That demonstrates that that causal relationship is the nature of the efficient relationship between creative reasoning and the universe. That is the individual creative reasoning and the universe. This gives us the map. Whenever we go away from this map, we are wrong. Whatever we build, there is a fundamental fallacy in it if we depart from this map. Hence, the monadology is perhaps the most essential document in all of physics. You will note that Leibniz, in essence, says in his own terms of reference exactly what I say here, which is not entirely accidental. About the age of 13 to 14, I learned this from Leibniz directly. I wrestled with it then for over a year, and I got it into my head. So today, I don't have it necessarily in the form I learned it from Leibniz, although I was stimulated to my discovery by him. I have learned it in my own way, but I can go back now and find that what I am saying and what he is saying are really the same thing, in the sense we are talking about exactly the same phenomenon and are posing exactly the same questions.
Okay. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Well, it's funny, just because that end part does represent a progression of knowledge. He's saying he was stimulated to his discovery by Leibniz. So while he's, it's just an example of what you're talking about with like the progression of an idea, lawful ordering of.
Yeah. Well,
It's
it
just
talks about successive scientific revolutions,
Yeah.
providing access to knowledge.
So well, it sounds like he's giving a disclaimer that he's not exactly.
Giving us a what?
Well, it sounds in the end that he's giving a disclaimer that it's not exactly in Leibniz's exact terms of reference.
Yeah.
He's just giving an example of maybe how he progressed upon Leibniz's idea. It's an example of what he's talking about.
Well, yeah, that's true. I think that is true. Leibniz didn't have it in this form. He did not talk about looking at a sequence of discoveries and the higher hypothesis that connects them. He did not have that. Nobody's had that until then.
Yeah.
Nobody's done that. That's his. One thing that occurred to me is Kepler's idea that the fundamental relationship of each planet is to the sun, and only secondarily to the other planets. So I think this is. I think that would be I think that would be a case in point of that. Probably you can think of other.
Would you say that Lynn's idea of the hypothesis, generating new hypothesis, is the analog to how the universe itself develops? Like,
Yeah.
in the case of
The universe is creative, therefore it develops new modes of new principles or new expressions of these principles, and it's negentropic.
like the development of life from single cells to multiple cells to whatever.
Yeah, I think that would be certainly be a case of negentropy. Yeah. But also the relationship of each new species to the biosphere. That is, according to Vernadsky, a species develop because they have a certain relationship to the biosphere as a whole. They increase the anti-entropy of the biosphere as a whole. I think Vernadsky has said something along, I think, pretty much equivalent, equivalent to that. Yeah. So if you can't get that up, we can just read it directly from my book.
I got it.
If you can't put that next one up that I wanted.
I can get it.
No disaster, we can just read it from my book.
If anyone wants to read off of the book copy.
This is something else.
This is the new system of nature, right?
I'm sorry?
The new system of nature.
No, it's the one to 498, begins page 498. On nature, that's it, on nature itself, yeah, that's it, yeah.
Sorry. This thing is a little tricky sometimes. Was this the one about Robert Boyle's proposal?
That's it, yeah, that's it, yeah.
Where is this located? And what text is this taken from?
She's asking where it's from.
Oh, okay, it's from this book, Lonker, Philosophical Papers and Letters, okay? Leibniz, Philosophical Papers and Letters, okay. Yeah. All right, somebody wanna?
Could we see the title again? Okay.
Of creating
Sorry?
things.
Go for it.
On nature itself, or on the inherent force and actions of created things. I'm going to read the intro.
Yeah, go ahead.
Robert Boyle's proposal in his free inquiry into the vulgarly received notion of nature, that the term nature should be avoided and mechanism substituted for it, occasioned a controversy between John Christopher Sturm of Altdorf and Günther Christopher Schellhammer of Kiel in 1692-98, in which Sturm defended Boyle's opinion, while Schellhammer defended the concept of nature. One of the points argued concerned the source and nature of motion. Sturm defending the Cartesian position that God is its only source. Though the correspondence which began between Leibniz and Sturm in 1695 avoided the central question of the status of nature, it turned on the independent reality of the natural order, including man. Sturm maintaining that it is pagan and unchristian to attribute properties to the nature of things, and that nature has no energy or force proper to itself. Leibniz's published reply is directed not only at Sturm, but at the occasionalists and others who in effect deny the reality of the physical world. It contains a careful exposition of his reasons for a pluralistic, energistic system, and one preeminent for its revelation of the motives and the nature of his argument. Ernie, do you agree with that commentary?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, just
I
wondering.
think, yeah, I think
Okay.
it's, so, yeah.
So, one, I've recently had sent to me the apology published in Altdorf by that most noted and in mathematical and physical matters deservedly famous man, Christopher Sturm, in defense of his dissertation, De Idolo Naturae.
What would that mean, the idolization of nature? From the context, I think he's sort of the
Yeah.
worship of nature,
It's
something like, yeah.
whatever it means, which had been attacked by an outstanding and most gifted physician of Kiel, Günther Christopher Schellhammer, in a book on nature. I too had long ago pondered the same problem, and I also carried on a kind of disputation by letter with the famous author of the dissertation, which he himself has recently mentioned in a way that honors me, since he makes public mention of certain papers which passed between us in the first volume of his Elective Physics, Book 1, etc., etc. I was therefore all the more willing to set my mind and attention to this argument, which is so important in itself, judging it necessary to explain my own opinion and the problem itself a little more clearly in terms of the principles which I've now stated so many times. His apologetic dissertation seems to offer a convenient occasion for beginning this, for we may judge that the author has here set forth in a few words and from a single perspective the most important issues involved in the matter. I'm not making the quarrel between these famous men my own, however. Two questions are, I believe, of most importance. The first, in what does the nature consist, which we customarily ascribe to things, whose attributes, as they are usually understood, Mr. Sturm considers to reek somewhat of paganism. The second, whether there is any energy in created things. This he seems to deny. As for the first question, on nature itself, if we are to discover both what it is and what it is not, I agree that there is no world soul. And I admit also that the wonderful events which occur daily and because of which we commonly say rightly that the work of nature is a work of intelligence are not to be ascribed to certain created intelligences endowed with wisdom and power proportional to such a task. But universal nature is, so to speak, the artifice of God. And such a work, indeed, that any natural machine, whatever, consists further of infinite organs. This is the true but little noted distinction between nature and art, and so entails an infinite wisdom and power on the part of its author and governor. So I consider the omniscient heat of Hippocrates, the soul-giving Chalcodeia of Avicenna, the most wise plastic power of Scaliger and others, and Henry Moore's hylarchic principle to be in part impossible and in part superfluous. I consider it sufficient that the mechanism of the world is built with such wisdom that these wonderful things depend upon the progression of the machine itself, organic things particularly, as I believe, evolving by a certain predetermined order. And I agree when this illustrious man rejects the figment of a certain wise created nature which forms and governs the mechanisms of physical bodies, but I do not agree, and I do not think it's conformable to reason that we should deny that any active creative force resides in things.
So what is, people, just wanna make sure, people, what do people make of this, what do they see as the issue that's being, debated here?
Well, when he's talking about a predetermined order.
About what?
Predetermined order, they're evolving by a certain predetermined order.
Well, yeah,
No
he believes in
predestination.
a certain predetermined order, but also he's saying that there are several people here that he doesn't agree with because they think that, quote, nature has certain intelligence in and of itself, that there are these powers I'm not familiar with any of these particular doctrines, but he's the omniscient heat of Hippocrates, the soul-giving Chalcodea of Avicenna, the most wise plastic power of Scaliger, and he said they're impossible in parts superfluous. What he's getting at is that to the extent that there is an order in nature, it comes from God, not from anywhere else. Okay, that's what he's saying, and you're going to see he's going to get. So he's taken on Shellhammer, okay, who seems to believe in that kind of thing. But on the other hand, you'll see that the guy he's directly talking to, Sturm, okay, that this guy is, in the name of being pious, he's attacking these guys, but on the other hand, he's not willing to acknowledge that God has put in certain capabilities or powers in nature which allow it to be to be bodies, you could say, to be self-sustaining. In other words, that it's like the thing with the clockwinder thing, in a way.
Right.
Okay, in the wisdom of God, He has so organized the world that it can progress, based on what He's impressed on it. Okay, so you'll see that's going to play out. So I just want to make sure. Okay.
You wanna continue?
Yeah. Unless someone else will comment.
I have said what nature is not. Let us now examine a little more closely what this nature is, which Aristotle has well called the principle of motion and of rest. Though that philosopher seems to me to take the term more broadly than its accepted meaning, and to understand by it not only local motion and rest in a place, but change and or permanence in general.
Can somebody read that?
It's Greek to me.
Yeah.
Otasis. Otasis.
Ah, shut up.
That's what oh no, stasis.
Stasis?
Stasis.
Ha!
I may also point out in passing.
We're all gonna believe it.
that- yeah, I may also point out in passing that the definition which he gives of motion, though more obscure than it should be, is not as inept as it seems to those who assume that he meant to define only local motion. But to return to the point, Robert Boyle, a man of distinction and thoroughly at home in the observation of nature, wrote a little work on nature itself, the argument of which, if I remember rightly, amounted to this: that we must hold nature to be the mechanism of bodies itself. Superficially this can be approved, but to examine the matter with greater care, we must distinguish principles from derivative matters within this same mechanism. Thus, it is not enough in explaining a clock to say that it is moved by a mechanical principle, without further distinguishing whether it is driven by a weight or by a spring. I have already expressed more than once a view which I believe will be of use in preventing mechanical explanations of natural things from being carried to abuse in injuring piety. As if matter can stand by itself and mechanism needs no intelligence or spiritual substance. The view, namely, that the origin of this mechanism itself has come not from a material principle and mathematical reasons alone, but from a higher and, so to speak, a metaphysical source.
Yeah, well, that's this is what you'll see over and over again is Leibniz says, yeah, you can explain things that go on mechanically. And he talks about reflection of light, or what goes on in collisions between bodies, but these laws themselves are designed in terms of the highest order of wisdom. and this is where you get the least action idea also. So he's saying that these other people don't have that, even though some of what they say is plausible. That they're missing the point of what he wants to bring out. So you'll see this again in the fourth. This one, so we can go ahead with that one.
One important indication of this, among others, is provided by the foundation of the laws of nature, which is not to be found in the principle that the same quantity of motion is conserved as had commonly been held, but rather in the principle that the same quantity of active power is necessarily conserved. And indeed, a thing which I discovered happens for a most beautiful reason. The same quantity of motive action also, the value of which is far different from what the Cartesians think of as the quantity of motion. After two mathematicians who easily rank among the foremost in ability had discussed this matter with me, partly in letters and partly in publications, one of them came over to my camp completely, and the other, after long and accurate thought, came to the point of abandoning all his objections and frankly confessed that he had not yet thought of any answer to my demonstration. I have therefore been all the more astonished that in explaining the laws of motion in the published part of his elective physics, this famous man has accepted the popular opinion about these matters as if no doubt of it were possible, though he himself acknowledges that it rests upon no demonstration, but only upon a kind of probability. This he has repeated in his latest discussion, chapter 3, section 2. But perhaps he wrote this before my own views had appeared, and then either had no time to revise what he had written, or did not think of it, especially since he believed that the laws of motion are arbitrary, a view which does not seem to me to be entirely consistent. For I think that God has been led to set in motion the laws which are observed in nature through determined principles of wisdom and by reasons of order, and that this makes clear what I once pointed out in discussing the laws of optics, a view to which the famous Molyneux later gave his approval in his dioptrics. That final causes are useful not only for virtue and piety in ethics and natural theology, but also for discovering and detecting hidden truths in physics itself. So I could have wished that when the famous Sturm, in dealing with final causes in his elective physics, referred to my opinion among the hypotheses, he might also have appraised it fully in his criticism, for he would then undoubtedly have taken occasion to say many excellent things in behalf of the excellence and fruitfulness of the argument, things which would be useful for piety as well.
The page before, it was talking about active power being conserved, okay, and that this was a fundamental law. Well, that's referring to what everybody's seen at one time or another. We call vis viva, and that was Leibniz was not the only one who, I think, figured that out. I think Huygens got it, and a couple of British mathematicians. But Leibniz's assessment of it and significance of it is that he develops is totally is totally unique, because what he does is he relates that to, out of that he says you can only have that if there's some first of all there's what he's going to be talking about, this monad or substantial form of this, he otherwise calls it, that actually provides unity to physical bodies. In other words, you'll see, he says physical bodies are only phenomena. They're not real, for reasons that he develops. They're not real. What is real is force. In other words, this vis viva is, it's already there in the body, and it's just activated like in a collision, and bodies then react with their own elasticity and bounce off each other, but they're actually acting on the basis of the force that they already contain within them. And that idea is unique to Leibniz. But from then he goes on to develop. You'll see he develops this idea of first of all this idea that the monads only react. The monads don't really influence each other. They're all basically there's a kind of a pre-established harmony by which they interact. Fundamentally they're interacting with the creator himself, not all the other monads, and so that's one aspect of that. But then that's the main idea there. The pre-established harmony actually is one of the outgrowths of that observation. We'll go a lot more into that.
Are you saying that the monads have nothing to do with each other?
He said they don't have windows. That's how he put it. They have an internal representation of each other, but it's all sort of predetermined. Capability is predetermined.
Is it empirical?
I'm sorry.
Does he mean empirical?
I mean
Does he mean empirical?
empirical.
Mm-hmm.
That I couldn't say whether it's empirical, but he says that's the way. Well, it's like his idea about preformation. In other words, that the embryo, that all the living things, all of life was present at the creation, formed at the creation, and if any creature has its sperm, inside the sperm is another little creature. Inside that creature has sperm, and so on ad infinitum. So actually everything, all living things were present at the creation. It's this preformation idea that he had was coherent with this idea of the pre-established harmony. That's what I'm saying. So it's quite a remarkable doctrine that he had. And I didn't realize he had that until this recently, and I'm really getting into Leibniz's ideas about biology. Part of it is, I mean, the references to it in these books like Lone Curve, but it's only in more recent years a lot of his writings on biology have been translated, and people getting a real picture. And a lot of stuff he wrote about medicine, enormous amount. He had tremendous interest in medicine from the standpoint of improving people's health. It was not just a study of physiology and so on. He was totally committed to the idea that health was essential to the well-being of a society.
So that people would live longer. So that people would live longer.
Live longer and be more creative.
Exactly.
Above all, be more creative. Okay.
Ernie,
All right.
but there's, in the,
Speak up.
So,
what?
Just stand up there so it's going loud.
Oh, no, but there's also, in the monadology, he also talks about the higher monads,
yeah,
which is the human creative
yeah,
monad that Lynn is referencing in that excerpt that you were from the Science of Christian Economy.
yeah.
I mean, the higher monad really ends up being the key to understanding how the whole thing.
Well, that's what that thing that we read, because
Right.
he's saying the model for all the monads is the relationship of the sovereign human being to the universe.
Right,
That's
and
your
the fact
map.
that you can only discover these principles that seem to be disguised to some extent by examining the process of creativity in the human
Yeah,
mind.
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
One thing that, when I was reading the monadology, is that it'd be a big mistake to try to think of monads as things,
Right.
right? The monad is not a thing,
That's right.
it's something else.
It's a
different-
he calls it a substance. It's that which acts. Anything that acts is a substance, and substance is that which acts. He gives those two things.
So it'd be like a soul. It would be a soul.
No.
The soul is the highest monad. Yeah, that's right. What's also interesting, he says that all these other monads are present at the creation, but the human soul apparently takes form only at conception. So the human seems to be different for some reason. That- So that was brought out in the book I just read on, it's called Divine Machines. Remember, he talks about what's unique about living things, that they are machines, every subdivision of which, down to the infinitesimal part, are also machines. Okay, okay, it's totally different from other things, living things. And that's why biology for him, in a way, was the most important, quote, science, because that's provided the basis for his view of the lower monads. Okay, so that's definitely very important to know that about Leibniz. So we can go ahead. So, oh, Eli wants something to say something.
That question that was brought up by Denise, monads do not act between themselves, but harmonically. Is that again?
Speak a little louder for me. I'm hard of hearing. I'm sorry.
The question that Denise brought up, and I'm just going over the same question that we read out loud, that monads do not act between themselves, but harmonically.
Yeah, there's a pre-established harmony. They don't sort of bounce off each other. That's yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I just gave this example, elastic collision. That seemed one way that he came up with it. Well, I think he had much broader consideration. Yeah.
5. Are we up to 5, or didn't finish the last sentence?
Somebody want to
All
read?
right, I can read. 5. But now we must examine what he says in this apologetic.
Can you speak up, please?
But now we must examine what he says in this apologetic dissertation of his about the concept of nature, and what seems still to be lacking in what he says. He admits, chapter 4, that motions now taking place result by virtue of an eternal law once established by God, which law he calls a volition and command, and that no new command or new volition of God is then necessary, much less a new conatus, or some laborious effort. And he rejects as wrongly ascribed to him by his opponent the opinion that God moves things as a wood chopper moves his axe, or a miller controls his mill by shutting off the water or turning it into the wheel. But this explanation does not seem to me to do justice to the truth. For I ask whether this volition or command, or if you prefer, this divine law once established, has bestowed upon things only an extrinsic denomination, or whether it has truly conferred upon them some created impression that endures within them. Or, as Mr. Schellhammer, who is as distinguished in judgment as in experience, very well puts it, an internal law from which their actions and passions follow, even if this law is mostly not understood by the creatures in which it inheres. The former view seems to be that of the authors of the system of occasional causes, especially of the ingenious Mr. Malebranche. Mr. Malebranche. The latter is the accepted view, which I believe the truest. For since this command in the past no longer exists at present, it can accomplish nothing unless it has left some subsistent effect behind which has lasted and operated until now. And whoever thinks otherwise renounces any distinct explanation of things. If I am any judge, for if that which is remote in time and space can operate here and now without any intermediary, anything can be said to follow from anything else with equal right. It is not enough, therefore, to say that in creating things in the beginning, God willed that they should observe a certain law in their progression. If his will is imagined to have been so ineffective that things were not affected by it, and no durable result was produced in them. In any case, it also conflicts with the concept of the divine power and will, which are pure and absolute. For God to will and yet to produce or changed nothing by his willing, for him always to act, but never to achieve, and not to leave behind any work or any accomplishment. What's that one, Frank?
Apotelesma.
Surely if nothing has been impressed upon creatures by that divine word, producat terra, multiplicemini animalia. If things are affected after the command, just as if no command had intervened, it follows, since some connection, either immediate or mediated by something, is necessary between cause and effect, either that nothing conforming to the command is now happening, or that the command was valid only in the present and must always be renewed in the future. But the learned author rightly repudiates this view. If, on the other hand, the law set up by God does in fact leave some vestige of him expressed in things, if things have been so formed by the command that they are made capable of fulfilling the will of him who commanded them, then it must be granted that there is a certain efficacy residing in things, a form or force, such as we usually designate by the name of nature, from which the series of phenomena follows according to the prescription of the first command.
Good. I think it's pretty clear. Maybe somebody has wanted to comment or a question about where he's going. I think it's clear where he's going.
It's quite a beautiful idea. Because normally, the mundane way of thinking of things, well, there are spiritual things, and then there are things,
Yeah.
which are dead.
Yeah.
So here he's saying that every so-called thing has a living force in connection to God.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a certain liberating quality.
I would think so.
There's an aha quality to that idea.
It also implicitly is this idea of intention.
Yeah.
That there's a directionality and
Oh,
intention.
definitely, you'll see that. He refers to these forms as entelechies, and tel, I think refers to teleology or purpose here. Yeah. So, I guess even in those days it was hard to get people to accept that. Compared now, it's virtually impossible. People say you're nuts, you know. All right. Okay.
This inherent force can indeed be understood distinctly, though it cannot be explained by sense perception. It is no more to be thus explained than is the nature of the soul. For this force belongs among those things which are grasped, not by the imagination, but by the understanding. Therefore, I interpret this learned man's request in chapter 4, section 6 of his apologetic dissertation, that we explain to the imagination the way in which such an inherent law can operate in bodies ignorant of law, as meaning that he wants it explained to the understanding, for otherwise it might be thought that he was asking for sounds to be painted or colors heard. Furthermore, if difficulty in explaining something is a sufficient reason for rejecting it, this must also be applied to be consistent. To the view which he complains is ascribed to him unjustly, chapter 1, section 2, namely that he prefers to hold that all things are moved by divine force alone, rather than to admit anything by the name of nature, of whose nature he is ignorant. Certainly Hobbes and others who tried to make everything corporeal, could also depend on this argument with as much right, since they have convinced themselves that only body can be explained distinctly and in sensible imagery. But these men are rightly refuted by the very fact that there is a power of action in things which we do not derive from sensible images. And simply to refer this back to a command of God, given at one time in the past and in no way affecting things or leaving an effect behind it, is so far from explaining the matter that it is rather to put aside the role of the philosopher and to cut the Gordian knot with a sword. For the rest, a more distinct and accurate explanation of active force than has heretofore been given may be drawn from my Dynamics, which contains an appraisal of the laws of nature and of motion that is true and in harmony with things.
Pretty clear.
But if some advocate of the new philosophy, which maintains the inertness and deadness of things, should go so far as to deprive God's command of all lasting effect and efficiency in the future, and to regard it as nothing to demand of him always new arrangements, a view which Mr. Storm wisely rejects as foreign to his own, it is his own affair to decide how worthy he considers this of God. But we cannot excuse him from giving us a reason why things themselves can have an enduring permanence, while the attributes of things, which we designate as their nature, cannot have this permanence. For it is nevertheless consistent that just as the word fiat leaves behind it something permanent, namely the persisting thing itself, so the word benedictio leaves behind it something in things no less wonderful, a fruitfulness or an impulse to produce their actions and to operate, from which activity follows if nothing interferes. To this can be added the point I have made elsewhere, but perhaps not everyone has understood it adequately as yet, namely, that the substance of things itself consists in the force of acting and being acted upon. Hence it follows that no enduring thing can be produced if no force that long endures can be impressed upon it by the divine power. Then it would follow that no created substance, no identical soul would be permanent, and hence that nothing would be conserved by God, but everything would reduce to certain evanescent and flowing modifications or phantasms, so to speak, of the one permanent divine substance. And what reduces to the same thing, God would be the nature and substance of all things, a doctrine of most evil repute, which a writer who was subtle indeed, but irreligious in recent years imposed upon the world, or at least revived. Surely if corporeal things contained nothing but matter, they could most truly be said to consist of a flux, and to have nothing substantial, as the Platonists long ago recognized.
So that's Spinoza that he's referring to there, huh? That's Spinoza?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Yeah, uh-huh. So it sort of, he says it was also an older doctrine, so maybe he's also speaking about the Eleatics, I would guess, as well, yeah. Uh-huh. Okay.
Isn't this, again, a critique by Leibniz that the general
you hear him?
everything
I
was-
can't hear him,
You
no,
gotta
I
speak
cannot.
up.
You have to speak louder, I'm hard of hearing, I'm sorry.
Isn't the material that we just read out loud
Yeah,
Leibniz statement against a blasé that all is change and everything just transformed into another substance and never really exit, never really disappears, but just transforms itself to something else, which then in a process transforms itself, and nothing is lost, but just changes. That this is a qualification and of that tendency of thought that everything is simple change. That Leibniz is saying something more than that statement. Here that we just read.
well, I think I think he has in mind, Leibniz is saying it's a kind of a flux that what you would have, but it wouldn't be differentiated. There'd be nothing creative about it, and there would be no reason for it to take place because it wasn't really it wasn't going any place. Okay, there's no. It's not organized. Basically, it's not organized in any way. There's no way to just differentiate one stage of it from the next stage. So it's just a blah. I think that's what he's saying. He'll bring that point out a bit later, exactly that point, in his when he discusses in his refutation of the arrow paradox and the nature of motion. You'll see that.
So do we wanna continue?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
The second question is whether creative beings may be said properly and truly to act. If we once understand that their internal nature is no different from the force of acting and suffering, this question reduces to the former one, for there can be no action without a force of acting, and conversely, a power which can never be exercised is meaningless. Yet since action and power are different things, the former a matter of succession, the latter permanent, let us examine action also. Here I confess I find no little difficulty in explaining the opinion of the famous Mr. Sturm, for he denies that created things by themselves properly act, yet he nonetheless admits that they do act, since he is willing to have.
Unwilling.
I'm sorry, what?
He's unwilling.
Oh, okay. Oh, since he is unwilling to have ascribed to him the comparison of created things with an axe moved by a woodcutter. I can make out nothing certain from this. He does not seem to me to have explained very clearly how much he departs from accepted opinions, nor what sort of distinct concept of action he has in mind, for that the concept of action is not an easy or obvious one is clear from the conflicts of the metaphysicians. So far as I have made the concept of action clear to myself, I believe that there follows from it, and is established by it, that most widely accepted principle of philosophy, that actions belong to substances. I take that that's the Latin. And hence I hold it also to be true that this is a reciprocal proposition, so that not only is everything that acts an individual substance, but also every individual substance acts without interruption, not excepting body itself, in which no absolute rest is ever to be found.
Continue?
That's what you were saying before about substance is what acts and action is what is substance.
Yeah, I was just anticipating that, yeah. Uh-huh. In other words, if you don't have action, if something isn't he said that if something isn't acting, it doesn't really exist. That he's quite explicit. Otherwise, you just have undifferentiated, what do you call it, continuum, blah. It's not.
The question about no absolute rest, could it exist? Isn't that similar to Kuza's idea that when you go to the infinite small, and infinite as a concept, or infinite large, once it's in the infinite as a concept, infinite large or infinite small, those ideas are higher than before things approach that, before they arrive even as infinite small, or before they arrive at the infinite large. Isn't that a Kuza idea that Leibniz is saying that there is no absolute rest? Because if it was an absolute rest, isn't that like Kuza's absolutely small?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. I definitely, he's very much a follower of Kuza. I would agree with that. Yeah. What do you want to?
10. But let us now consider a little more carefully the opinion of those who deny a true and proper activity to created things, as Robert Flood, the author of the Mosaic philosophy, long ago did, and as some of the Cartesians now do, who believe that things do not act, but that God acts in the presence of things and according to the fitness of things, so that things are occasions, not causes, and merely receive but never effect or produce. While this doctrine had been proposed by Cordemoy, LaForge, and other Cartesians, it was particularly Malebranche who, with his characteristic acumen, embellished it in luminous phrases. But, so far as I know, no one has given sound reasons for it. Certainly, if this doctrine is extended so far as to deny even the imminent actions of substances, an interpretation which Mr. Sturm shows his conspicuous caution in rejecting in his Elective Physics, Book 1, Chapter 4, Epilogue, Section 11, it seems foreign to reason as no other view can be. For who will doubt that the mind thinks and wills, that many thoughts and volitions are produced in us and by us, and that there is something spontaneous about us? To doubt this would be to deny human freedom and to thrust the cause of evil back into God, but also to contradict the testimony of our internal experience and consciousness, by which we feel that what these opponents have transferred to God, without even the appearance of a reason, belongs to ourselves. To doubt this would be to deny human freedom and to thrust the cause of evil back into God, but also to contradict the testimony of our internal experience and consciousness, by which we feel that what these opponents have transferred to God, without even the appearance of a reason, belongs to ourselves. But if we ascribe to our mind an inherent force of producing imminent actions, or what is the same thing, of acting imminently, then nothing prevents the same force from residing in other souls or forms or if you prefer, in the natures of other substances. Indeed, it is entirely consistent for it to be so, unless it is believed that in the nature of things which is open to us, our minds alone are active, or that all power of action is immanently, and hence vitally, so to speak, coupled with the other understanding. But such assertions are certainly not confirmed by any reason, nor can they be defended without coercing the truth. What we can establish about the external transient actions of creatures may better be explained elsewhere. In fact, I have already partly explained it. The intercourse of substances or of monads, namely, arises not from an influence, but from a consensus originating in their pre-formation by God, so that each one is adjusted to the outside while it follows the internal force and laws of its own nature. It is also in this that the union of soul and body consists.
Quite a revolutionary doctrine, isn't it?
Yep. He didn't like Jehovah Witnesses.
What?
He didn't like the Jehovah Witnesses. It's all God's fault, he can't do anything.
So, wanna continue? Or we should, we can have
5
time,
minutes.
we have, what, we have 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
By
read
that
number
clock, we
11.
have 5 minutes, we'll go by that clock. That's a little slow.
All right. It is indeed true, however, that bodies in themselves are inert, if this is understood in the right sense, namely, insofar as what is once assumed for some reason to be at rest cannot impel itself to motion, or suffer being impelled by some other body without resistance, any more than it can of its own accord change the degree of velocity or the direction which it once has had, or suffer such change from the outside easily and without resistance. So it must be admitted that extension, or the geometric nature of a body, taken alone, contains nothing from which action and motion can arise. Indeed, matter rather resists being moved by its own natural inertia, as Kepler has fittingly named it, and is thus not indifferent to rest and motion, as it is popularly interpreted to be, but strives toward motion with an active force proportional to its magnitude. Hence, it is in this passive force of resistance, which involves impenetrability, but something more, that I locate the concept of primary matter, or mass, molis, which is everywhere proportional in a body to its magnitude. And hence I show that far different laws of motion follow from it than would be the case if the body, or matter itself, possessed only impenetrability with extension. And just as there is a natural inertia opposed to motion in matter, so there is in the body itself, and indeed in every substance, a natural constancy opposed to change. This view does not justify those who deny action in things, but rather opposes them. For as certain as it is that matter in itself does not begin motion, so certain is it also, as the well-known experiments on motion arising from the impact of a moving body also show, that, taken by itself, a body retains an impetus and remains constant in its speed, or that it has a tendency to persevere in the series of changes which it has once begun. Now, since these activities and entelechies,
Yeah.
cannot be modes of primary matter or of mass, which is something essentially passive, as a judicious Sturm has himself clearly recognized, as I shall show in the next paragraph, it can be concluded that there must be found in corporeal substance a primary entelechy, or first recipient of activity, that is, a primitive motive force, which, superadded to extension, or what is merely geometrical and mass, or what is merely material, always acts indeed and yet is modified in various ways by the concourse of bodies through a conatus or impetus. It is this substantial principle itself which is called the soul in living beings, and substantial form in other beings, and inasmuch as it truly constitutes one substance with matter, or a unit in itself, it makes up what I call a monad. For if these true and real unities were dispensed with, only beings through aggregation would remain. Indeed, it would follow that there would be left no true beings within bodies. For even though there are atoms of substance, namely my monads which lack parts, there are no atoms of mass or of minimum extension or any last elements, since a continuum is not composed of points. Furthermore, there is no being that is greatest in mass or infinite in extension, even if there are always things greater than any given things. There is only a being greatest in intention of perfection or infinite in power.
We interrupt this pedagogy to bring you yet another birthday. Bon